Risk management is a very important part of addressing the day-to-day activities to which you're responsible. I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations. If you want greater influence, greater control over processes and outcomes, then you must understand that certain checks or observations are necessary to detect or prevent specific risks. Every activity you do, everything you focus time on has risks associated with it, and those risks could cause a negative outcome to what your objective is. So if you work in a regulated environment, you understand what I'm talking about. There's certain information you can send cross-border. There's certain types of information that needs to remain private when you're working with a customer. There are laws, rules, and regulations. But for folks outside of these regulatory or compliance heavy industries, you need to understand effective control development because it is a way to check your work as you're conducting the work so that you're more likely or you increase the probability of having a favorable outcome for the activity. So if you're going to do something that has an aspect of safety, if you're doing something that has a monetary gain or loss, if you're doing something that has any associated risk, and we could talk about risk categories at another time, the key is you can make a list of the risks associated with doing or not doing the activity that you're discussing. So in a safety environment, there is a risk of not conducting specific safety measures. So you're got a construction site on the side of the road. The different safety activities around that might be proper cones, proper signs, allowing the sign, putting the signs in place far enough up the road that oncoming traffic can know that there's a construction going on. These are factors that are often codified in the procedures that you give your staff or your team when they set up a site. However, how do you develop these? Well, I'm going to look at what would an auditor look like. So if there was an accident, if there was a risk, if something happened badly, first, how bad could it be? I'm not saying that sarcastically. I'm asking the question. If you don't properly mark a construction project on a country back road, it has less of a risk than a construction project on the side of a busy highway. Now, in either case, the risk could be damage to other people's vehicles, which is a legal liability, but there could also be bodily harm and damage. So if you've got insurance on your job, you can basically look at the insurance policy about what they cover because there's certain categories of risk that you can insure. Now, the insurance policy itself becomes a control against that risk. However, the prevention or detection of possible defects or risks in the environment are likely to be more cost effective. So what do I mean by that? Yeah, you could buy enough insurance that even if your guys set up a bad job and there's bodily harm or there's an accident or someone dies, that your insurance don't worry about it, the insurance will cover it. But over time that'll get very expensive, so it's better to go ahead and set up the safety in advance. So what you're going to look at is, what would an auditor look like? What would somebody who's going to pay out that claim look like to determine whether there was any negligence on your part, and what would negligence look like? So again, this is the criteria of the risk, and it starts to form the requirements of what your control activity, a control activity prevents or detects a specific risk, of what your control activity would need to do. Now, this is important stuff. It doesn't sound like something that a lot of people go through because the concept of risk management is often, it's left to highly regulated environments, but you're doing it every day and not realizing it. Some of the activities or instructions that you receive build in the risk management. But I wouldn't rely on that. There are people who sued McDonald's because the coffee was too hot. Anyway, so next you're going to look at who owns the risk. So if we continue with the construction site example, you may not expect the guys doing the work or running the excavator to properly put out cones and signs. That may need to be part of the process that happens prior to equipment coming on site. Let me explain why this is important. The process, the risk, and the controls you use, they all have relationship. But in application, they have associated costs and they have associated constraints. So if someone is driving heavy equipment and you know that you need proper clearance for the bucket on that heavy equipment, So you got a piece of equipment that can spin around in circles with a bucket that can knock things over. So often they will put out cones, or they'll set up a perimeter that's the work site, and that equipment will then insert itself within that perimeter and operate under certain safety criteria. Well, if you have the driver of the excavator having to get out and move the cones around, that's not as cost effective as having someone on site who's been properly trained to move those cones around. So we're starting to look at not only the control, because we need effective controls that are actually executed, but we're now looking at how would we implement it? Who would implement this? Who owns the particular risk? So the job foreman might own the risk, because if something goes wrong on the job site, the foreman's going to be first to know. The operator of the equipment may own a certain amount of risk because they're controlling the piece of equipment. But then the site manager, or the individual who's setting up the work, or even a helper, may own the risk of flagging traffic so that it doesn't get too close to the zone where the equipment is operating. Measuring distances to understand that the boom has a maximum reach, and therefore we have to keep people outside of that maximum reach so that when it swings around with a load of dirt, it's not hitting somebody in the head. We need to make sure that since we have this equipment on site, that people are wearing helmets, because there's now an overhead risk of falling items. Do you see where I'm coming from here? This is systems thinking, and it puts you in a position where now you deliver very high value to the job site because it's safer, it's more time efficient, it's more monetarily efficient, but ultimately the people that are doing the work aren't going to recognize that you're doing anything. They aren't going to understand. It's going to be common sense to them that you're going to stand away from the equipment so you don't get swiped in the head when the range of motion of the equipment. It's common to this, but it's not common to somebody driving down the road. It's not common to somebody who didn't know there was a construction site on. So we're now taking your understanding of the process and we're expanding it with the risk perspective to make the overall environment safer, to make the job not eventful. Actually, when you're doing operational risk correctly, it is completely transparent to everybody involved because the pieces are in place to get the results that you're looking for. So we also want to consider what level of the organization to do work. In the construction site example, it's probably not going to be the guys on the ground doing this thinking. They're focused on doing the work. They're not doing this thinking about distance from equipment. They're literally just implementing the safety guidelines for the site. Now, OSHA has a bunch of safety guidelines. So you don't have to develop anything. You can just grab it from the OSHA guide. But if your business hasn't trained individuals from the OSHA guide, you will see 8 guys standing around a hole while an excavator is pulling dirt out of it, and guys jumping out of the way periodically when the excavator goes to drop the dirt in a pile. Ultimately, what we're doing here, and I know I'm giving you a very simple example, but this is an example everybody can relate to. But essentially what we're doing here is have to determine what level of the organization would that control exist. Now, what is the control itself? Well, the control is some kind of activity that you're going to use to prevent or detect risk. And the risk that we're talking about here is the risk of bodily harm from a job site. And if we cannot rely on the individuals to both do the safety measures and monitor safety measures, because sometimes they're going to say, oh man, it's a lot of work to put some cones down. It's a lot of work that I got to put 125 foot of cone out here, and then I got to put a sign a half mile up the road. Man, this job's going to take 10 minutes. It's going to take longer to put the signs up than it's going to take to do this job. So we're just going to do the job. Next thing you know, speeding vehicle in the hole that you're digging, and you've killed a whole family, including small children. I'm being sarcastic here because ultimately, if you look at the level of the organization, you know that a safety inspector is going to come out. You're going to have somebody who runs the sites and goes around to verify these measures have been put in place. And then you're going to periodically review the measures as you're setting up the job so that you know what measures you're expecting to inspect. So again, what level of the organization? Now, I know I've whirlwind and driven through the effective control development. Let me repeat some of the key areas that you want to review. You want to make sure that you're preventing or detecting specific risk. When you plan a project out, you want to inventory the potential risks, laws, rules, and regulations, safety, health, other issues associated with the work to be done. This does mean that you need to know what outcomes you're looking for. What is the work being done? You want to periodically review this to make sure things are on track. These controls are going to be specifically written to describe the who, what, when, where, and why of an activity that is a decision point. So if an inspector comes out to the site and they see that you haven't properly marked electrical and utilities before you started excavating in the middle of a road, they stop the job. So a control very often stops work, causes them to reset, and that reset then incorporates the safety measures or the compliance with the laws, rules, and regulations. You want to know what those specific requirements are. You want them spelled out. That way you can give people proper training to understand the work at hand and to be able to know what's going on. Now, the individuals doing the job may not know the specific controls as a control. They may just know that if we're going to set up for an excavator, here are the 5 things that we do. They may not know why. Now, it's important you teach them why. That way they understand and they don't skip and cut corners. But ultimately, the control could be built into the implementation of an OSHA regulation or the best practices from a manufacturer for implementing or using a piece of equipment. It might be regular training and certification before you let somebody jump up into a piece of heavy equipment. Again, I'm giving you the heavy equipment example because it's practical. Everybody's seen a construction site on the side of the road, and they've seen some of the safety measures, but they just didn't know what they were. You also want to know who owns the risk and therefore who would own the control itself. Now, the person who owns the control may not be the same person who then comes through and audits or implements the control, but they ultimately own the control and make sure the control is congruent with the process, the risk, and the other activities that are going on in hand. Now, I argue from a strategic relations perspective, you should always be thinking about the economic factors as well, because controls are often perceived as adding additional unnecessary costs to an activity. But ultimately, like an insurance policy, you can only hit that thing so many times before it's going to start causing problems. So you need to make sure that you're reducing defects, you're reducing risk over time, and that you're ultimately doing it at an economically viable rate. Because the most surefire risk reduction is just not doing the work in the first place. And there may become a point where it's not worth doing a job because it costs so much to safety a job. And see that's it's costs so much to stay compliant with the laws, rules, and regulations. Because again, we've got these layers of risk. If you do a job that you cannot afford to do, the risk is your company will go out of business. You have an economic risk. If you do a job that's not safe and you cut corners and then there's a failure, now you've got a reputational risk because now everybody knows that you didn't do the job right. Risk management is about achieving the outcomes you desire in a boring and uneventful way. Meaning you just get the work done. There's no rework. It's just done. And in order to do that, you need to think about what level of the organization that risk is going to be managed. If it's managed too high, it may not be specific enough for the individuals to implement. If it's managed too low, you might end up with different parts of the organization doing the same work different ways. I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations, and this has been an introduction to effective control development. And I'm sure you have some questions. It's okay. You may not have any questions, but if you do, you want to visit www.insidestrategicrelations.com. When you can develop controls, when you can analyze risk, you're more likely to be able to produce the outcomes desired. Or in large complex projects, ensure not only the outcomes that your client desires, but no regulatory fines, no regulatory intervention that can cause work to take longer. These are valuable skills, and they are relationship-based skills as much as they are technical skills. And I want to thank you for listening. Again, if you have any questions about effective control development, operational risk management, or the different other applications of strategic relations, Visit me at my website, www.insidestrategicrelations.com. I'm Justin Hitt, and I help you transform business relationships into profits, guaranteed.